On a quiet afternoon in April, a farmer in Franklin County, Tennessee, walked out into his field. It was a Wednesday. The air was cool. The sky was finally clearing after a week of rain. He was checking his fence line, just doing the mundane work of a life lived outdoors. But then, he saw something lying in the tall grass. It didn't belong there. It was blue, a patch of denim against the green. He walked over to it, bent down, and picked it up. It was a pair of jeans, Wrangler blue jeans. They were heavy, but not because they were wet. He ran his hand over the fabric and realized they were cold, ice cold. They were frozen stiff. He looked at the label, he looked at the size, and then he looked up at the sky. There were no clouds above him, but these jeans hadn't come from his house. They hadn't come from his neighbor's house. They had just fallen from 30,000 feet. These jeans belonged to a worker at a factory in Hackleburg, Alabama, 60 miles away. They had been ripped from a shelf, sucked into the troposphere, frozen solid by the sub-zero temperatures of the upper atmosphere, and tossed across state lines like confetti. We are told that tornadoes are wind. We are told they are dangerous. But on April 27, 2011, the sky over Alabama didn't just produce wind. It produced a machine that didn't just break things, it erased them. This is the story of the forgotten monster, the Hackleburg-Phil Campbell EF5, the tornado that moved faster than you can drive. April 27, 2011. If you live in the American South, you don't need me to tell you what that date means. It is a scar on the calendar. It is the day the atmosphere declared war. We call it the Super Outbreak. Over 300 tornadoes touched down in 24 hours. You've likely seen the footage from Tuscaloosa. You've seen the massive wedge moving through the city, live on television. That storm became the face of the disaster. But while the cameras were pointed at Tuscaloosa, something statistically stronger, faster, and deadlier was tearing a hole through the rural countryside to the north. It was a storm that defied the logic of survival. Usually, you have a chance, you have a basement, or a storm cellar. You have a warning, you have a car. But this tornado broke the rules. It moved at 70 miles per hour, forward speed. Think about that. 70. If you were driving down a winding country road in Marion County, doing 50 or 60, checking your rearview mirror, this tornado would be gaining on you. It would be passing you. It wasn't a storm you could outrun. It was a predator that hunted at highway speeds. And it started with a feeling. Ask anyone who was there that morning. They will tell you about the air. It didn't feel like air. It felt like soup. Heavy, sticky, oppressive. Meteorologists call it loading the gun. The atmosphere is a fluid engine. And on the morning of April 27th, that engine was being flooded with premium fuel. There was a low-pressure system sitting to the west, spinning like a top, pulling deep, moisture-rich air from the Gulf of Mexico. Warm, wet air was streaming north into Mississippi and Alabama. At the same time, high above the ground, the jet stream was screaming, cold. Dry air was punching over the top of that warm soup. When you put cold air on top of warm air, the atmosphere becomes unstable. It wants to flip over. It wants to explode. We measure this potential energy with a metric called CAPE, Convective Available Potential Energy. On a normal thunderstorm day, a bad weather day, you might see CAPE values of 1,000, maybe 2,000. On the morning of April 27th, over northern Alabama, the CAPE values were pushing 4,000. The sky wasn't just unstable, it was volatile. It was gasoline waiting for a match, and the match was lit early. At 4 a.m., a line of severe storms moved through. It knocked out power. It woke people up. It battered roofs and flooded roads. And then the sun came out. This was the worst possible scenario. If the clouds had stayed, if the rain had kept falling, the atmosphere might have stayed cool. It might have stabilized. But the sun came out. It began to heat the ground. It cooked that moisture-rich air, adding even more energy to the system. By noon, the National Weather Service in Huntsville and Birmingham wasn't just worried. They were terrified. They issued us high-risk outlook. Now, You have to understand the language of meteorology to understand the weight of those two words. High risk. The Storm Prediction Center issues outlooks every day. Marginal risk, slight risk, moderate risk. High risk is reserved for the days when they know, simply know, that people are going to die. It is the highest level of alert on the planet. It is virtually never used. But on April 27th, the map of Alabama was painted pink, high risk. And tucked inside that forecast was a phrase that made even veteran storm chasers pull off the road and check their maps. PDS. Particularly dangerous situation. This wasn't just going to be a tornado day. This was going to be a historic event. Back in Hackleburg, a small town of about 1,500 people, life was trying to go on. Hackleburg is the kind of place where everyone knows your truck. It's the kind of place where the geography of the town is defined by who lives where. Turn left at the Miller place. Go past the old church. The heartbeat of the town was the Wrangler distribution center, a massive, sprawling factory that employed a huge chunk of the population. If you lived in Hackleburg, you either worked at Wrangler or you were married to someone who did. It was a concrete fortress, big, solid, the kind of building you'd run to if a storm was coming. It was 2 p.m. The shift change was coming up. People were on the floor, moving boxes, checking inventory. The radio was playing in the background. But the news wasn't good. James Spann, the legendary weatherman in Alabama, the man whose voice is the soundtrack of disaster in the South, was on the air. He had been on the air for hours. He had taken off his suit jacket. That's the sign. If James Spann is in his shirt sleeves, you seek shelter. He was looking at the radar, and he was seeing something that shouldn't exist. Usually, supercells, the thunderstorms that produce tornadoes, are distinct. They are little kidneys on the radar screen, but on this day, the radar looked like a bowl of spaghetti. There were storms everywhere, and they were all rotating. At 2:45 p.m., a cell began to organize over the Mississippi border. To the untrained eye, it was just another blob of red and yellow on the screen. But to the meteorologists watching the velocity data, it was a nightmare coming to life. The storm was breathing. It was inhaling that massive amount of unstable air, the Cape of 4,000, and it was spinning it up into a tight, violent column. This brings us to the physics of the monster. Most tornadoes are somewhat lazy. They meander. They move at 30 miles per hour. If you see one 5 miles away, you have 10 minutes. You have time to grab the photo album. You have time to get the dog. But the upper-level winds on April 27th were screaming at incredible speeds. The jet stream was dipping low and driving these storms forward like a freight train. As this cell crossed into Marion County, Alabama, it synced up with those upper-level winds. It began to accelerate, 40 miles per hour, 50, 60. It was moving so fast that the radar scans couldn't keep up. By the time the radar beams swept the storm, processed the image, and sent it to the TV station, the tornado was already a mile further down the road than the picture showed. The data was old the second it arrived. And it wasn't just the speed of the storm over the ground. It was the violence of the rotation. We measure rotation with a term called helicity. It's the corkscrew effect in the atmosphere. That afternoon, the helicity values were off the charts. The air wasn't just rising, it was being sheared and twisted with extreme violence. 3 p.m. The cell is now approaching Hamilton, Alabama. The sky in the southwest turns a color that is hard to describe. It's not black, it's not green. It's a bruised, dark purple, and it's low. This is the wall cloud, the lowering of the storm's base where the tornado will be born. Usually, a wall cloud hangs down like a pendant, but this wall cloud was so massive, so wide, that people on the ground couldn't tell where the cloud ended and the earth began. It looked like the horizon itself was rising up to meet the sky. Inside the houses near Hamilton, the power flickered and then died. The hum of refrigerators, the buzz of air conditioners, the glow of televisions, it all vanished. Silence, but only for a second, because then came the sound. Survivors often say it sounds like a freight train. That's the cliché. But for an EF5 moving at 70 miles per hour, the sound is different. It's a continuous, low-frequency rumble. It vibrates your chest before you hear it with your ears. It feels like the earth is grinding its teeth. 3:05 p.m., southwest of Hamilton. The rotation tightens. The funnel drops. It touches the earth. At first, it's spindly, a gray rope dancing through the trees. It snaps pine trees like toothpicks. It tosses a barn roof into a field. If it had stayed like that, it would have been just another tornado in a year full of them. But the atmosphere was too rich. The gun was fully loaded. The tornado inhaled. In the span of minutes, it grew. It widened. It went from a rope to a cone to a barrel. It darkened as it began to eat the forest. That's what you see when a tornado turns black. It's not the cloud. It's the debris. It's the dirt, the trees, the structures being pulverized and sucked into the vortex. It crossed Highway 78. Drivers slammed on their brakes, watching a wall of debris cross the road in front of them, moving at highway speeds. And then, it turned its eye toward Hackleburg. The distance between Hamilton and Hackleburg is about 15 miles. At 70 miles per hour, do the math. 15 miles, that's less than 15 minutes. In Hackleburg, the sirens began to wail, but sirens are mechanical. They are distant. They are easy to ignore if you've heard them 100 times before. People looked out their windows. They saw rain, heavy, driving rain. That's the other secret of this storm. It was rain-wrapped. The precipitation was wrapping around the tornado, hiding it like a curtain. You couldn't see the funnel. You couldn't see the monster. All you could see was a wall of gray water. You wouldn't know it was there until the rain started clear, cutting the forest. At the Wrangler plant, the managers made the call. Get to the center, get to the safe areas. Hundreds of workers began to move. They left the line, they left the jeans on the sewing machines. They moved toward the interior hallways. They didn't run. There was no panic yet. Just a drill. Just another stormy spring day in Alabama. They didn't know that 3 miles away. The tornado had just widened to half a mile. They didn't know that the wind speeds inside the funnel had just breached 200 miles per hour. They didn't know that the safe areas in their building were about to become open air. The timeline was compressing. 3:10 p.m., the tornado is on the ground, and it is angry. It is scouring the pavement off the roads near the Marion County line. 3:12 p.m. The roar is audible in Hackleburg now. It's getting louder. It's not a rumble anymore. It's a scream. The air pressure begins to drop. Your ears pop. The windows in your house bow outward. The air feels like it's being sucked out of your lungs. At the National Weather Service, the radar tech watching the screen sees the debris ball, the blob of solid matter being lofted into the air, explode in size. He knows what it means. He knows it's hitting structures. He grabs the microphone. Tornado emergency, Hackleburg, you are in immediate danger. But the power is out. The TVs are black. The only warning left is the sound. Imagine standing in your living room. You are holding your kids. You are in the hallway. You have a mattress over your head. You are doing everything right. You are following every rule you were ever taught. And then you hear it. It's not coming from one direction. It's coming from everywhere. The house begins to shake, not a rattle. A violent shudder. The nails in the framing begin to scream as the wood is twisted. And then, for the people of Hackleburg, the world went black. The time is 3:15 p.m. The monster has arrived. 3:15 p.m. Hackleburg. There is no more time. There is no more warning. The wall of water hits the Wrangler plant first. It sounds like gravel being thrown against the metal siding. Millions of pebbles, clicking, scratching, screaming against the steel. But that sound only lasts for seconds. Because then, the roof peels back. It doesn't fly off. It dissolves. One moment, there is a ceiling, fluorescent lights, the hum of ventilation. The next, there is only the sky. A churning, black, violently rotating sky. The air inside the factory is instantly sucked out. If you are inside, your ears don't just pop, they scream with pain. The pressure drop is so severe, so sudden, that the capillaries in your eyes can burst. And then, the walls give way. This isn't a movie. In movies, walls fall over. In an EF5, walls are atomized. The brick, the mortar, the steel beams. They are caught in a blender moving at 200 miles per hour. They become the weapon. The wind isn't just wind anymore. It is a soup of shrapnel, wood, glass, metal, jeans. The factory, the economic heart of this town, is dismantled in less than 60 seconds. It is gone. And the tornado, it doesn't even slow down. It accelerates. It tears through the clay pit mines. It rips through the subdivisions. 18 people die in Hackleburg in the blink of an eye. There is no time to say goodbye. There is no time to pray. There is only the roar, and then the void. One survivor described it as being inside a washing machine filled with bricks. You don't know up from down. You don't know if you are still in your house or if you are flying through the air. And just as quickly as it arrived, the roar fades. The storm is moving so fast, 70 miles per hour, that it clears the town in seconds. It leaves Hackleburg bleeding and broken and sprints toward the northeast, toward Phil Campbell. Now. I need you to understand the physics of what is happening inside the funnel right now. Usually, tornadoes pick things up and throw them. They toss cars. They toss roofs. But as the tornado crosses into Franklin County, it intensifies. It is now nearly a mile wide. The wind speeds are pushing well past 200 miles per hour. At that speed, the wind acts like a sandblaster. It doesn't just push, it scours. It is digging into the earth itself. It is grabbing the grass and pulling it out by the roots. It is grabbing the topsoil and vacuuming it into the sky. If you are in its path, you are not fighting wind. You are fighting a grinder. And straight ahead lies the town of Phil Campbell. 3:30 p.m. The residents of Phil Campbell have been warned. They know Hackleburg has been hit. They know it's coming. Families are huddled in bathrooms. They are in closets. They are covering their heads with pillows. But they are expecting a tornado. They are not expecting this. This is where the golden rule of survival breaks. We tell people, get underground. If you can't get underground, get to an interior room. But in Phil Campbell, the houses aren't just leveled. They are swept clean. When a tornado sweeps a foundation, it means there is nothing left. No sticks, no furniture, no carpet. Just a bare concrete slab, polished by the wind. Imagine the force required to do that. To take a 2-story house and wipe it off the face of the earth so completely that you could sweep the foundation with a broom. That is the violence hitting Phil Campbell. And for those who went underground, the horror was different. There is a story, a nightmare really, from a storm shelter near the center of the path. An underground shelter, concrete, steel door, buried deep in the Alabama red clay. The safest place in the world. The family is inside. They can hear the monster approaching. The ground is shaking so hard that dust is falling from the concrete ceiling. And then, the pressure, the door, the heavy steel door designed to withstand the apocalypse, begins to rattle. The wind outside is moving so fast it creates a vacuum. It is trying to suck the door open. The father grabs the handle. He pulls. He is fighting the atmosphere itself. But the storm is stronger. The door is ripped from its hinges. It flies off into the dark. And suddenly, the shelter isn't a shelter, it's a hole in the ground. The wind screams across the opening. Debris starts falling in. Mud, tree limbs, parts of their own house. They are huddled in the corner, screaming into the roar, watching the sky pass over them at 200 miles per hour. They survived, but they saw the face of the devil. Others were not so lucky. In the Oak Grove community, the scouring was absolute. Cars were not just tossed, they were granulated. Rescuers would later find car parts, not a chassis, not an engine block, but pieces of metal, shredded, twisted, unrecognizable, a Ford pickup truck reduced to a ball of metal the size of a recliner. And inside that debris, inside that grinding, churning wall of black, was the town itself. Photographs, deeds, clothes, toys. They were being lofted higher and higher, up to 30,000 feet. The updraft of the storm was so powerful, it was injecting debris into the jet stream. That is why the jeans landed in Tennessee. That is why checks from Phil Campbell were found in Kentucky. The storm was broadcasting the tragedy across the entire southeast. 4 p.m. The tornado has been on the ground for an hour. Most tornadoes die by now. They cycle. They choke on cold air. They lift. But this machine is just getting its second wind. It crosses into Lawrence County. It is aiming for Mount Hope. It is aiming for Tanner. Tanner, Alabama. If a town can be cursed, it is Tanner. In 1974, during the first Super Outbreak, Tanner was hit by 2 F5 tornadoes, back to back. It was wiped off the map, and now, 37 years later, the ghost has returned. The residents of Tanner look west, and they see the same nightmare their parents saw. A wedge, wider than it is tall. It looks like the horizon is boiling. The exhaustion set in. By now, the news anchors are tired. Their voices are cracking. They have been tracking this single storm for over 60 miles. It's still down, they say. It's still on the ground. It refuses to die. It hits Tanner with catastrophic fury. Large high-tension power towers, giant steel skeletons, are twisted like pretzels. Pavement, actual asphalt, is ripped from the roads. Think about that. We drive on asphalt because it is durable, because it stands up to semi-trucks and heat and ice. This wind peeled it up like a strip of tape. If you were hiding in a ditch near Tanner, you weren't safe. The ground itself was being erased. 4:30 p.m. The storm crosses into Limestone County. It is finally starting to weaken. But weaken is a relative term. It is still an EF3. It is still a killer. It crosses I-65. It tosses cars off the interstate. But the inflow is getting cut off. The cold air is wrapping around the circulation. The funnel begins to narrow. The wide, horrific wedge begins to shrink back into a cone. It lifts its foot, touches down again, lifts, and touches down. It is gasping. It crosses the border into Tennessee. And finally, after 132 miles, after leaving a scar visible from space, after killing 72 people, it lifts into the clouds. 4:50 p.m. And then, silence. Have you ever heard real silence? Not the quiet of a library, not the quiet of an empty room. I mean the silence of absence. The birds are not singing. They are dead, or they have fled. The insects are gone. The cars are not driving. The electricity is out. So there is no hum of the grid. The only sound is the sound of things falling. A piece of sheet metal fluttering down from the sky, hitting the ground with a clank, a tree limb finally snapping and crashing into the mud, and then the weeping. It starts low, a moan, a name being called out. Mom? David? Is anyone there? You crawl out of the debris. You are covered in mud. It's in your hair. It's in your eyes. It smells like pine sap, and natural gas, and pulverized drywall. You stand up. You look for your house. It's not there. You look for the street sign. It's not there. You look for the trees that have stood for 50 years. The massive oaks that shaded your backyard, they are gone. Not fallen. Gone. You look at the ground, and you see the earth. Red, raw, scarred earth. The sun comes back out. That is the cruelest part. The storm passes so quickly that the sun comes back out. It shines down on a landscape that looks like the surface of the moon. You try to walk, but you can't. There are nails everywhere. There is insulation, that pink, itchy fiberglass, coating everything like snow. You hear a siren in the distance, but it sounds far away. It can't get to you. The roads are gone. The world is gone. You are standing in the center of the erasure, and you realize, with a cold dread in your stomach, that you have to find your neighbors. You have to find them, but you don't know where their house was, because everything is just flat. The silence didn't last long. It was broken first by the screams and then by the chainsaws. But before the rescue could begin, the survivors had to understand what had happened to them, and that was harder than you might think. When you look at a tornado track on the news, you see a line on a map. It looks clean. It looks defined. You think, okay, the damage is here. The safe zone is there. But on the ground in Hackleburg, there were no lines, there was no geography. First responders jumped into their trucks in neighboring counties. They drove toward the smoke. They drove toward the radar signature. But when they got to the edge of town, they stopped. They stopped because the road didn't just end. The road was erased. Highway 43, a major artery, was impassable. Not because of trees across the road, but because the trees were the road. Imagine a blender that has taken an entire forest, an entire subdivision, and an entire factory, and pureed them into a wall of debris 20 feet high. Firefighters got out of their trucks. They looked at their GPS. They looked at paper maps, and they shook their heads. Where is Main Street? I don't know. Where is the school? I think it's over there, by that pile of brick. That's not the school, that's the church. No, the church was wood, that's brick. They were lost in their own town. The landmarks were gone, the water tower, bent, the signs, vanished. The reference points of a lifetime, obliterated in seconds. And then, there was the smell. If you talk to anyone who walked into Hackleburg or Phil Campbell that afternoon, they will tell you about the smell. It is a scent that haunts them. It's a mixture of things that shouldn't be mixed. Freshly snapped pine, that sharp, clean scent of sap. It smells like Christmas, mixed with natural gas, the hissing, rotten egg smell leaking from thousands of sheared pipes, mixed with wet insulation, and under it all, the metallic, copper scent of blood. It was an olfactory assault, and as the sun began to set, the reality of the Wrangler plant situation began to set in. Remember, the plant was a fortress. It was supposed to be the safe spot. When the first responders finally climbed over the debris mountains to get to the site, they didn't find a building. They found a skeleton. Steel beams, massive I-beams as thick as a man's waist, were twisted into corkscrews. Some were bent flat against the ground. The concrete walls had collapsed inward, but the workers, the people who had huddled in the center, many of them had survived. How? Because the walls fell around them. They were trapped in pockets of rubble. Help! Over here! We're down here! The voices were coming from under the piles. It became a game of pickup sticks, played with 1,000-pound slabs of concrete. You move one piece, and the whole pile shifts. You risk crushing the person you are trying to save. There were no cranes yet. There was no heavy machinery, just men and women, digging with their hands, tearing at rebar until their fingers bled. And while they dug, the meteorologists arrived. This is the part of the story where we have to switch gears. We have to take off the survivor's hat and put on the investigator's hat. Because what happened in Hackleburg and Phil Campbell wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime scene. And the perpetrator was physics. The National Weather Service sends out survey teams after every tornado. Their job is to rate the damage, to determine the wind speed. They use the EF scale, the enhanced Fujita scale. It goes from 0 to 5. EF0 is a nuisance. Shingles off. EF1 is a scare. Mobile homes pushed over. EF2 is a disaster. Roofs off. EF3 is a tragedy. Walls collapsed. EF4 is a nightmare. Houses leveled. But EF5 is rare. It makes up less than 1% of all tornadoes. To get an EF5 rating, you have to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the wind speeds exceeded 200 miles per hour. You can't just look at a flattened house. An EF4 can flatten a house. You have to look for the indicators of extreme violence. And in Phil Campbell, the surveyors found them. They walked up to a foundation. The house was gone. The debris was gone. But they looked closer at the concrete slab, the anchor bolts. The thick steel rods that bolt the house to the foundation were not just bent. They were empty. The nuts had been unscrewed. No. The wood sill plate, the bottom frame of the house, had been ripped away with such force that it stripped the threads off the steel bolts, or, in some cases, the bolts themselves had snapped. Do you understand the force required to snap a steel anchor bolt? We are talking about millions of pounds of lift. But then, they looked at the ground. We mentioned ground-scouring earlier, but let's really analyze what that means. Grass has a root system. It is a mesh. It holds the soil together. To remove grass, you need a shovel or a plow. The wind in Phil Campbell acted like a plow. It removed up to 2 feet of topsoil. It dug a trench. The surveyors took photos of a field where the corn stubble hadn't just been blown down. It had been pulled out, and the dirt underneath it was gone. And then they found the cars, or what was left of them. There is a gruesome physics to what happens to a vehicle in an EF5. At 150 miles per hour, a car rolls. At 180 miles per hour, a car flies. At 210 miles per hour, a car disintegrates. The wind gets under the hood. It rips the hood off. It gets into the cabin. It blows the doors off. Then, as the car is tumbling through the air, the centrifugal force tears the engine block from the chassis. They found a Ford Mustang wrapped around a tree stump. It wasn't just bent around it. It was melted around it. The metal had deformed so plastically that it looked like fluid. Based on this evidence, the surveyors didn't hesitate. They marked the map. EF5, estimated peak winds, 210 miles per hour. But some experts, looking at the damage later, argued that 210 was conservative. They looked at the speed of the storm, they looked at the scouring, and they whispered numbers that they were afraid to publish. 230, 250. We will never know the exact number, because the anemometers, the instruments designed to measure wind, were destroyed. The storm killed the very tools used to measure it. Now, I want to talk about the missing. In the days following the storm, a chaotic list of names began to circulate. Has anyone seen Sarah? Has anyone seen the Miller family? Facebook, which was still becoming a major tool for disasters in 2011, lit up. People posted photos. Missing, last seen at 3 p.m. Most of them were found, in hospitals, in shelters, in the homes of strangers, but some stayed missing. And this brings us to the most haunting mystery of the Hackleburg tornado. The bodies that were never found? No. They found the bodies. It was the placement of the bodies. Remember the story of the blue jeans, the ones that fell in Tennessee? That wasn't an anomaly. There were reports of personal effects, substantial items, being found 30, 40, 50 miles away. A family photograph from Phil Campbell was found in a front yard in Majestic, Tennessee. A high school diploma, a checkbook. But the dark reality is that the storm treated living things the same way it treated inanimate objects. There were victims found, not in their yards, not in their neighbors' yards, but hundreds of yards away, across lakes, deep in the woods. The violence of the updraft was so extreme that it defied the laws of ballistics. It created a debris field that wasn't just local, it was regional, and for the survivors, this created a psychological horror that is hard to articulate. Imagine standing on your foundation. You survived, you are alive, but everything you own, every memory, every picture of your grandmother, every piece of jewelry is gone. It hasn't just been destroyed, it has been exiled. It is sitting in a tree in the next county. You have been erased, you are a refugee on your own property. Week 1. The National Guard arrived. They brought Humvees. They brought checkpoints. Hackleburg became a fortress again. But this time, it was to keep people out. Looters. It's a sad reality of human nature. When the walls fall down, the vultures come out. People came from out of state. They drove trucks looking for scrap metal, looking for copper, looking for anything they could steal from the dead. The residents, the ones who had lost everything, armed themselves. Spray-painted signs appeared on plywood. You loot, we shoot. Nothing left to steal. It was a lawless time. The police were overwhelmed. The sheriff's deputies were working 20-hour shifts. They hadn't slept. Some of them had lost their own homes, but they put on the badge. They stood at the checkpoints. They turned people away. And amidst the chaos, there were moments of grace. The Cajun Navy mentality before the Cajun Navy was famous. People from Mississippi, from Georgia, from Tennessee, loaded up their trucks with water, with chainsaws, with casseroles. They didn't know anyone in Hackleburg. They just knew that their neighbors were bleeding. They drove to the roadblocks. We have water, they said. We have diapers. We have hands. And the community slowly began to breathe again. But the cleanup? Oh, the cleanup. How do you clean up a town that has been granulated? You can't just use dump trucks. They had to bring in heavy equipment to literally scrape the earth. They had to burn the debris. For months, the sky over Marion County was filled with smoke, not from the storm, but from the pyres. They were burning the remnants of the past, the wood, the trees, the furniture. It was a funeral pyre for a way of life. And as the debris was cleared, the scar became visible. If you looked at satellite imagery from Google Earth in May 2011, you saw it. Alabama is green, deep, lush green. But across the northwest corner, there was a brown streak. It looked like someone had taken a giant eraser and dragged it across the map. It was wide, it was jagged, and it was absolutely brown. That was the path. 132 miles. It went through forests. It went through towns. It went through rivers, and it didn't care. That scar stayed visible for years. Even today, a decade later, you can still see it if you know where to look. The trees are younger in the scar. The vegetation is different. The forest is trying to heal, but the wound is deep. And inside the town of Hackleburg, the scar is different. They rebuilt the school. They rebuilt the police station. But they couldn't rebuild the Wrangler plant. The company, Wrangler, they were good to the town. They paid the workers while they were closed. They tried, but eventually, the economics won. They decided not to rebuild the distribution center in Hackleburg. It was a death blow. The storm took the lives. Then, it took the livelihood. Hackleburg today is a different place. It is cleaner. The buildings are newer, but it is quieter. The hum of the factory is gone. The physical scars heal. It takes time. It takes money. It takes an army of contractors and volunteers. But eventually, the concrete is poured. The framing goes up. The drywall is painted. You can rebuild a house. You can rebuild a school. But the invisible scars, those are the ones that don't fade. In the years following April 27th, the mental health crisis in Marion and Franklin counties was silent, but it was deafening. They call it lilapsophobia, the fear of tornadoes and hurricanes. But for the people of Hackleburg, it wasn't a phobia. It was a rational response to a traumatic memory. Every time the sky turned dark, the panic returned. School children would start crying when the thunder rolled, not just a whimper, hysterical, inconsolable crying, because they remembered the sound of the roof tearing off their gymnasium. Veterans, men who had served in wars, found themselves shaking uncontrollably when the siren tested on Wednesdays. The weather radio became the most important appliance in the house. Before 2011, people ignored them. After 2011, people bought two. One for the bedroom, one for the kitchen. They put fresh batteries in them every month. They slept with their shoes on. Think about that. Sleeping with your shoes on for months, just in case. Because they learned the hard lesson. When the monster comes, you don't have time to find your sneakers. And they learned the nature, for all its beauty, is indifferent to our suffering. Which brings us back to the blue jeans. We started this story with a pair of frozen Wranglers in a field in Tennessee. Now, we need to understand the physics of why they were frozen. Because that single detail, that pair of pants, tells the story of the storm's power better than any wind speed measurement ever could. To freeze a pair of dry jeans requires a freezer. To freeze a pair of wet jeans requires time. But the storm didn't have a freezer, and it didn't have time. So, how did it happen? It happened because the updraft of the Hackleburg tornado was a rocket engine. When the tornado hit the Wrangler plant, it didn't just blow the jeans sideways. It ingested them. It sucked them into the core of the vortex. And then, it shot them upward. In a normal thunderstorm, the updraft might move at 100 miles per hour. In this supercell, the updraft was likely moving at 150 or even 180 miles per hour, vertical velocity. It shot those jeans from the ground to 30,000 feet in less than 3 minutes. Do you know what the temperature is at 30,000 feet? It is 40, maybe 50 degrees below zero. It is the stratosphere. The jeans were wet from the rain. They were soaked. And when they hit that sub-zero air, they didn't just freeze. They flash froze. They became ice sculptures. And then, the storm spit them out. They rode the jet stream, drifting north, floating on the violent winds of the upper atmosphere, until gravity finally took over. And they fell. They fell for miles. They tumbled through the clouds. They tumbled through the clear air, and they landed, stiff as a board, in that farmer's field. That is the scale of the energy we are talking about. We are talking about a storm that could take the contents of a human life and turn them into high-altitude projectiles. It is a reminder that we live on a planet that is wild. We pave it. We build cities on it. We put up fences. But the atmosphere is still in charge. So, what is the legacy of the Hackleburg-Phil Campbell tornado? Why do we talk about it? Why, more than a decade later, are you listening to a 45-minute documentary about a storm that hit small towns you might never visit? Because it was the forgotten giant. The Tuscaloosa tornado got the fame because it hit a city with news cameras. It was tragic. It was horrific. But the Hackleburg tornado was the meteorological apex of the outbreak. It was the storm that maxed out the scale. It was the storm that proved that you can do everything right and still lose. It changed the way meteorologists talk to the public. Before 2011, warnings were polite. Seek shelter. Move to a safe area. After 2011, the language changed. Now, you hear phrases like catastrophic damage expected. You will not survive if you are above ground. Unsurvivable. They realized that to save lives, they had to scare people. They had to break through the apathy. The legacy of those 72 people who died is the survival of the next generation. Because when the sirens wail now in Alabama, people listen. They remember the scouring. They remember the asphalt ripped from the road. They remember the silence. If you go to Hackleburg today, you can still find the path. The town is there. The people are there. They are resilient. They are tough. They are Southern. They have rebuilt their homes. They have replanted their gardens. But if you drive out of town, onto the county roads, and you look at the woods, you will see it. You will see a line where the old oaks stop and the young pines begin. It is a scar on the landscape, a line of demarcation. On one side, the past. On the other side, the post-storm world. And if you get out of your car and you walk into those young woods and you look closely at the ground amidst the leaves and the dirt, you might still find something. A piece of twisted metal, a shard of blue glass, a rusted bracket from a car that hasn't existed in 10 years. These are the fossils of April 27th. They are the reminders that, for a few minutes one afternoon, the sky touched the ground. And when the sky touches the ground, nothing is ever the same. The wind has stopped, the roar is gone. But the story of the day the earth was scoured, remains. We must remember them. We must remember the names. We must remember the town that refused to be erased. Because the atmosphere is reloading. The gun will be loaded again. And next time, we have to be ready. This has been the story of the Hackleburg-Phil Campbell EF5. Thank you for listening.